Awesome. Well, thanks for having me here. I'm excited to talk to everybody, even though I'm having to kind of look out over top of my monitor and pretend that there's a crowd here instead of out virtually on the internet. So I'll try to look everybody in the eye as much as I can. But today I really want to talk about full observability with Grafana. So we'll do a little bit of review about what observability really means, and then talk about how Grafana fits into that today, and even then where we're going from here to the future with observability. And for anyone who's not familiar with Grafana, I promise I'll give a little bit of background on that. Want to give a little bit of background on Grafana itself, as well as on me, so you know who it is that's sitting here talking to you today. So for me, I am a solution engineer at Grafana Labs. So I actually do work for the company that supports Grafana, the open source project. And me, I'm an open source geek from way, way back. I got started in the 90s when Slackware was the easy Linux distribution, and you had a stack of 3.5-inch floppies, and it took a weekend to get installed. And I was hooked ever since then. So I guess I'm a glutton for punishment, but I love the open source community. But before becoming a solution engineer, in a previous life, I actually did IT operations management. So all of the things around monitoring systems and keeping the lights on in data centers, and getting paged at 3 o'clock in the morning when something went down and having to figure out what it was and how to fix it, I lived that life. So being able to be a part of that from the other side, from the tooling that helps the people doing that job, is really, really cool to me. It's very nice to be able to get into that industry, or to remain in that industry, and feel like I'm hopefully making a difference, even if a small one, in other people's lives, and keeping the lights on in those data centers, and hopefully keeping people from getting paged quite as often. And I live in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is just right outside of Boston. So I was super excited to have a Boston local conference to come talk at, and then the whole pandemic happened. So sadly, I didn't get to just get on the subway and see everybody face to face, but hopefully next time we'll make that happen. So that's me. What about Grafana? So Grafana is an open source data visualization platform. And it's been around for about 6 years, a little over 6 years at this point. It was actually started as a fork of Kibana. And really its entire goal in life is to be a beautiful, something easy to look at, but more importantly, useful way of visualizing metrics. So primarily looking at time series data or statistical data, and presenting that in a way that is both useful and easy on the eye. And really part of that design goal is to be what we call open and composable. So Grafana is built on an idea of being able to connect to as many different sources of data as possible. And in fact, having a plug-in architecture to make the addition of new data sources, as well as new ways of visualizing data, possible and even easy. So the goal is to have this source out in the open and have everybody be able to participate and plug their data into one location, and provide an easy way to visualize that. So how does that tie into observability? And I want to back up a little bit here and talk about observability itself, because I feel like it seems like a buzzword. It's the sort of thing that gets thrown around a lot. People don't always agree on what observability means, or how it differs from other similar terms like monitoring. But it actually is there for a good reason. It's not really just a buzzword. It's not the latest and greatest way of saying monitoring. In fact, observability and monitoring are really very different ideas. Monitoring is a process. Monitoring is something that you do to look at your environment, to try to understand your applications and see what's happening, how things are performing. But observability has a much longer history than even IT monitoring. It actually comes out of engineering and control theory. And so where monitoring is something that you do, observability is something that you have, or is a property of your systems. It's all about building a system so that the internal state of that system can be understood based entirely on the output of that system. It really means making things that are predictable so that we can understand what's happening inside of them based on what we see them do. So this is, you'll hear some people say sometimes that monitoring is a verb and observability is a noun. And that's what they mean by that. Monitoring is something that you do, you look at and keep tabs on your applications and systems. Observability is something that those systems have as a property. It is a noun. But that said, there are several verbs that make up observability. And you'll see differing opinions on what these are, and this kind of is constantly evolving, and I suspect we'll see more than these three pillars in the future. But if you go and you look up observability today and you look up observability strategies, these are the three things that you're going to see over and over. And they're logs, metrics, and traces. And really, in order to build an observable system, to have this property of observability, you want to have all three of these things in your environment. And so I'll talk just really briefly about what these things are, what the differences are, and how they contribute to observability as a property. So we'll start with logs. And logs are, I think probably everybody here understands logs. I'm sure everybody has seen at least one or two logs in the past. These are really the oldest of those three pillars. And logs came about when programmers and system administrators started to realize that they needed some understanding of the internal state of the systems that they were looking at. So they started having their programs and environments just emit messages when they reach certain points in a code path or a certain event happened. But because these were really driven sort of by an ad hoc need for developers and sysadmins to understand these systems, they were actually built to be human readable. So logs themselves tend to not have any one strict format. You might have very well formatted logs from one application, but that format is going to differ entirely from the logs from another application. And they also tend to be fairly verbose because they were built for humans to read. They have a lot of information to provide humans with context so that you can look at a log and figure out what's happening. And this is really useful if you're reading logs, if you're a person that's reading them, but it does drive a lot of the issues around computer parsing of logs. It actually turns out to be a fairly difficult problem to build a system that can internalize and parse all of these different types of logs. And I'll give an analogy to go with logs. If you think about flying a plane, logs are like the black box that contains all the information about what's happened in the flight during the flight of that plane. And that's super useful if the plane crashes, right? You want to go back through that black box and you want to find out every little thing that happened, everything that contributed to the state of that plane before it crashed. But it's a ton of data. It's way too much information to just glance at. So you're never going to fly the plane based on that black box data. It's something that you're going to pour through very carefully, but ideally only when you have a need to, only when you need to figure out what went wrong. Whereas on the other hand, metrics are much more like the dials and gauges that you're using to fly a plane. These are the altimeter or the pitch, yaw, and roll, or maybe even the fuel gauge in the plane, the sorts of things that you want to glance at and see immediately what's going on. You always want to be able to glance at these gauges and just know right away, what is my airspeed, what is my altitude, how many people are hitting my web application, is my database too saturated? So metrics are these sort of real-time, aggregate, simple views of data. So usually these are either just one number, so number of hits in the last minute, something like that, or could even possibly be just a simple yes, no, up, down sort of metric. They're designed to be very, very simple and contain the minimum amount of information to be useful. And you'll often take these single values, these simple values, and aggregate them across time to build up a time series. So this lets you see trends over time. So I know based on the number of hits yesterday and the number of hits today, I can start to project out the number of hits to my web application tomorrow. But I'm still only measuring those small values. I'm keeping things very limited in scope. So this is really the key value of metrics, is that they give you a quick glance, a single place to look for data. But of course, the flip side of that is they don't give you a whole lot of detail. So these are your gauges for flying the plane as opposed to the black box. Now, the final component, the final pillar in that observability stool is traces. And this is kind of where my airplane analogy falls down a little bit. I couldn't figure out a good part of an airplane to equate to traces. But you could maybe think of this as something like a combination of pre-flight checklists and the ability to look through the control systems of a plane and trace the path that every action in the cockpit takes to operate on some mechanism in the plane. When I push a button on the control panel, these flaps move in this specific way, and I can see every linkage from that button to when the flaps move. So traces are really about seeing an end-to-end path in a request or an operation that happens in an environment. And this is really similar to application performance monitoring, or APM. So if you've seen APM systems or you've used APM systems in the past, these concepts are probably pretty relatable, pretty understandable. But the difference between what we would think of as traditional APM and tracing, particularly distributed tracing, is that APM was really designed when monolithic applications ruled. When you had a single code base, you had one binary that was running everything, and you could instrument all of that code in one place and then just view what happens from end to end inside that monolith. But when you start introducing microservices, that model really falls down. Your microservices might be in entirely different languages, using different libraries. They may not even be running all in the same physical location. You might have some things on-prem and some things in the cloud. So being able to trace the execution of a request across all those different services is a really thorny problem. And that's where distributed tracing comes in. And I would say that logs and metrics at this point are pretty well understood. Doesn't mean that everybody is doing them perfectly or that everybody is perfectly happy with their strategy. But at this point, there's a lot of information, a lot of understanding out there about how logs and metrics work. Whereas traces are still kind of the Wild West. Everybody's still sort of working out the best way to do this, working out the best way to instrument applications or the right amount of data to collect. So if you're thinking about tracing, if you're trying to do this today and you feel like you're struggling, don't worry, you're in really good company. I think there's probably 3 or 4 companies in the entire world that have a really solid handle on this and feel like they're doing things right. Everybody else is still really working at it. So it is definitely a hard problem. I think that'll improve over time as some of these tools mature though. But I've talked a whole lot about observability, and I haven't really talked about Grafana, which was part of the title of the talk. So I want to bring it back a little bit and talk about how these concepts, how logs, metrics, and traces all fit into the Grafana story. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea behind Grafana is that it is open and composable. We really want to have this big tent philosophy where everybody can kind of work together and participate and share data and just make these sorts of wonderful observable systems happen. But in the real world, that kind of isn't the case. Like anybody who is actually doing this in practice knows that it always looks fantastic when you step back at the 30,000-foot view, but when you actually do this in day-to-day operations, it's kind of messy, right? Like if you get a page today, something has gone terribly wrong, I've got high latency in my web application, well, I start with that email or that Slack message or whatever, and then I'm probably going to go to a dashboarding system like Grafana that's keeping tabs on all those metrics. So I want to see that at a glance view of the entire environment. Is it just this one component? Are there multiple things that might be related? And am I seeing red across the board? Help me understand what's actually happening across my whole environment. And then from there, I'm probably going to dig more into the metrics. So maybe I go into something like Prometheus, which is gathering those metrics up, and I start writing some ad hoc queries to wrap my hands around the problem and figure out, narrow down the scope of what I'm actually looking for. Is it one specific component? Did it occur at one specific time? Once I've narrowed that down, I can then look at the logs that were collected around that time. Remember, I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible. Something has gone wrong, I've gotten paged. Maybe it is 3 o'clock in the morning and I want to go back to bed. So I want to narrow down the amount of those logs that I have to look for as much as possible. So I'm going to do those ad hoc queries so that I'm looking at the bare minimum level of logs required. But even then, I'm still going to have to do some searching around those logs. I'm still going to have to do some reading before I figure out where the underlying issue is. And once I've done that, once I've narrowed down to, say, some of those requests that are seeing high latency, then I can finally go into my tracing system and actually look at the underlying requests themselves, the path that every one of those requests took, before I can start to see which component of my app. And then, of course, once I've done that, I can finally some configuration changes in the environment that will actually fix the issue. And then hopefully I can go back to bed, even if this has taken me all morning. Now, this is kind of the way things are today. What we'd much rather see is a workflow where we can do as much of this as possible with one set of tools and really just in one view. And that doesn't mean that all of those tools, all of the metrics tools and logs tools and tracing tools are going to unite or are going to go away and just become one thing. They're all still there. But what we want is one place to interact with all of them. So this is the observability vision that the Grafana project is really working toward. So here the idea is I still get an alert. I get some kind of page to let me know that something's gone wrong. I'm still going to go look at a dashboard and say, is this a global issue? Is this isolated to some smaller subset of my environment? But from there, what we want to do is enable you to start doing some of those ad hoc queries on metrics, just right there from within the same dashboards that you were looking at. And even from those metrics, be able to narrow down and look at the logs that were collected at the time that those metrics were collected, or possibly even generate some of the metrics from the logs themselves. And then, of course, once you've narrowed down the search space and found the underlying issue in the logs, it should be very easy to go straight from there into a tracing view, figure out what the issue is, and then go write the code or make the environmental changes to fix it. So you're still accessing all of these tools. You're still using all of the power of all of these wonderful open source and sometimes even proprietary tools to gather this information. But you're doing it in a much faster way, and the sort of way that's going to get you back to bed half an hour or an hour earlier. You're going to be much, much more rested the next morning and probably a happier and easier person to be around. So how can we do all of this? How does Grafana want to approach this workflow? Well, the metrics side of things is pretty well-trod path inside of Grafana. Like I said, Grafana started about 6 years ago as a metrics visualization platform. It's been doing that for a long time. It really is the gold standard for open source metrics visualization. So I won't spend a lot of time on the metrics side. What I'd say is if you have questions around Grafana's metrics approach, I'm very, very happy to answer those. You can find me in the Speaker McCollam channel in Slack, or send me an email. I'll put up my email address later. Happy to answer questions, or you can just go download Grafana and play with it. This is something that's been there for quite a while. But what's new in this, this journey in Grafana is the visualization and ingest of logs. So this was actually just introduced in Grafana 6.4. We're on 6.7 now, so it's really only a few months old. But this is brand new functionality that is here to enable you to visualize, well, log data, to bring logs in next to metrics and see them in a single place, add them to those dashboards. And, as I said before, it's not usually super useful to look at logs on a dashboard view. It's not the sort of thing where you're going to just glance at something and say, okay, this is red, let me read 500 log messages in the next 10 seconds and figure out what's up. So what we want to do is give you some tools to work with these logs as if they were metrics. So Grafana can ingest logs and can connect to log sources, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But some of the power of the Grafana visualizations are being able to give you things like histograms of the logs that you are seeing. So here I just kind of pulled up a simple view for this screenshot of just the logs that I'm ingesting. But what this could also show me are things like the number of errors versus the number of just pure logs that I'm ingesting at all. So, is it that I'm seeing a huge increase in error rate, or am I just getting a huge increase in errors because I'm also getting a huge increase in log volume in general? Maybe a lot more people have just logged in lately. That's useful information to know, and it's the sort of thing that we want to be able to provide at a glance on a dashboard. We can also give a lot more underlying detail and the ability to search through those logs to get to the actual logs that you're looking for. And the way that that works varies, just like it does with metrics, based on the underlying log system that we're ingesting that data from, or I should say that we're visualizing that data from. And today, there's 3 log sources that are supported. That's Loki, Elastic, and Influx. In keeping with that whole open and composable idea, we're going to have many, many more of these. This is just going to continue to expand. I think the next one you'll probably see are the major cloud provider log sources will be part of that. But all of these always expose the underlying query language to you. So if you have Elastic logs and you already know how to query Elastic data, you know how to write Lucene, you can just continue to use that. You're just doing it inside of Grafana, so you don't have to leave and pick up a separate tool. And by the way, the logs panel right now, as I mentioned, is pretty new. So there will be a lot of UI improvement and user experience improvement to make this a more enjoyable and more useful experience. And you'll see that over the next few versions of Grafana. It's something that we're actually doing across the board with not only the log visualizations, but also the metric visualizations. There's a lot of work going into making those much, much simpler to use and modernizing the JavaScript frameworks that are underpinning those. But I'm running out of time, so I don't want to talk too much about that. Let's get back into.
Actually, sorry, Ron. So as it turns out, we do have a little bit of time, and you can optimize it for Q&A, or you can optimize it for kind of going into a little more detail. So feel free.
Perfect. Then I tell you what I'll do. I'll go back and I'll do that for just 1 second. Talk about this for maybe 60 more seconds. So part of what we are doing is moving all of the Grafana visualizations from React to Angular. And there's a lot of behind the scenes work that's happening there that will do things like make the components that are used in visualization plugins in Grafana more adaptable, more reusable. So right now, if you want to make your own custom visualization, you kind of have to write a lot of things from scratch. You have a lot of control. You can do basically anything you can do in a web browser in JavaScript with that. But it does mean that a lot of people are reinventing the wheel. A lot of people are kind of building their own statistics visualizations or graphing libraries. We want to avoid a lot of that work, so we're separating some of this UI out into reusable components. And you can actually start to see some of that pay off even in the latest couple of releases of Grafana. So for example, this screenshot here is from our new stats panel. Previously, if you've used Grafana in the past, you've probably seen the single stat panel, which, like the name implies, shows one statistic, just one number, which is fine, but it means if you want to show 10 different numbers, you need to have 10 panels and you have to manage all of those by hand. So we're factoring out these kind of things that people have to reinvent and have to reuse over and over in order to make them something that can be repeated automatically. So I can, instead of building out 10 different panels in the dashboard for 10 stats, I can just feed the stat panel 10 different statistics and it will just do the right thing. It will expand to fill the space as is most appropriate, continues to look very, very nice. But you're just going to see this kind of user experience improvement happen not only in the metrics visualization, but especially in the logs visualization. Like I said, it's just brand new, so it still has a lot of love to come. So moving on from logs, I want to talk about how this fits into traces. And like I said, traces is kind of tracing is the Wild West. This is the new hotness where everybody wants to get to. And this is the future vision of Grafana. So everything I'm showing right now is the direction that we want to move. The engineers made me promise to put the disclaimer on this that none of this is finalized. The look and feel and some of the behavior may change. But what I am showing is some of the prototypes that we have internally for how we're thinking about working with tracing data. And one of the things that we can do is capture what we're calling parsed fields from log data. So in certain cases, we can actually look at the structure of underlying logs and start to figure out what some of the fields in those logs contain. And that would include things like trace IDs. So we can actually just look at raw application logs, and if we recognize a trace ID in those logs, make that just actionable by default. Now, right now, actually, this support is in the latest version of Grafana. Right now, what that will do is just open up a new window. So if I click the trace ID, it will take me to my tracing tool and just kind of pass that in as a link. But what you can see from the screenshot in the upper right is that we are working right now on embedding those visualizations into Grafana itself. And that is going to mean that we're going to expand out the types of data sources that we have available in Grafana. So it started as just metrics. We now have metrics and logs. We're going to expand that to have metrics, logs, and traces as part of the, or as types of data sources within Grafana. This was scheduled for Grafana 7. I'm not 100% sure if it's going to be in the first release of Grafana 7 just due to COVID-19. Some schedules are getting reworked, but this is stuff that is actively being worked on right now and is coming out very soon. So I want to show what all of this looks like and how it all fits together so that you can actually see that full workflow, that full life cycle of receiving a page and going all the way through to fixing an issue. And excuse me, this video is also available on YouTube. So if it doesn't come through that well on Zoom, I'll definitely point people at a link. But what we're seeing here is that we have an application, and that application is emitting metrics, right? We're tracking the state of that metric, that app, we're monitoring it. And we come in here because we see that there's some unusual behavior. And so we can go straight from the dashboard into being able to do ad hoc queries, narrow down what's actually happening inside of the application. And then once I've narrowed down where I want to look, I can switch over to a logs view. And you can see I actually get taken straight to the most relevant logs. We perform basically a search based on the metrics that I had looked at. And then using this parsed fields, we see that these logs contain a trace. I can go straight from the logs into an embedded trace view inside of Grafana and start to narrow down to the underlying cause, the component that caused the issue that had me be paged. So really within 30 or 45 seconds here, it is admittedly a rig demo, but very quickly, I can go from receiving a notification that something's going wrong to actually finding the underlying root cause of that so that I can fix it and go back to bed. I've been paged at 3 in the morning. I know exactly what that feels like. So I do want to make sure I wrap up reasonably on time. So I'll stop here and happy to answer questions if folks have questions now. Otherwise, feel free to contact me in the Slack channel, or you've got my email address and contact info up here.